everyone, welcome to ASEAN Pacific Shows. In this episode today, we are going to talk about China and Latin America relations. There is several features that make this topic and subject extremely important. First of all, the Latin America located in a region in a geopolitical space which right next to its biggest political rival, United States. And at the same time, when we're talking about the China and Latin America relations, the China Latin America countries, at least most of them, not far away from China in terms of political culture and ideological background. Today, I have a guest who is an expert on China and Latin America relations. I believe that she will give us a broad perspective on these relations, historical and or current relations. My guest is Margaret Myers. Margaret is a director of the Asia and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue. She has published extensively on China's relations with Latin America and Caribbean region, the political economy of China-Latin America relations, and the changing currents of Trans-Pacific integration, China, the TPP, and beyond. Her co-edited volumes with Dr. Carol Weiss and Dr. Adrian Hearn, respectively, were published in 2016. Myers has testified before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs on China-Latin America relations and is regularly featured in major domestic and international media. Myers also worked as a Latin America analyst and China analyst for the U.S. Department of Defense, during which time she was deployed with the U.S. Navy in support of Partnership of the Americas. Myers was a Council on Foreign Relations term member. She was a recipient of a Freeman Fellowship for China Studies and a Fulbright Specialist grant to research China-Colombia relations in Bogotá. In 2018, she was identified by Global America as one of the new generation of public intellectuals. Margaret, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're welcome. I'm going to start with my first questions. Please tell us, to what extent does China look to compete with the US in Latin America region? Is it successful in doing so, or regardless of intent?
I think there's a lot of debate on this topic about the extent to which, China is actually aiming to compete head-to-head with the US in Latin America. Certainly, 10 years ago, when the relationship was really very much just ramping up, there was a lot of literature in China that suggested, and a number of very prominent and influential voices in China that argued against a very prominent and even aggressive approach to economic engagement or political engagement in the region, for fear of a U.S. backlash or a strong U.S. reaction of some sort. That appears to have changed, right? Under Xi Jinping, there is, I think, far less concern about provoking a U.S. response, whether in Latin America or other regions, or in international organizations for that matter. But I would say that, China's motivations in the region, in my view at least, are still largely motivated by the three tenets of the going out strategy, which directed Chinese overseas engagement back in the 1990s and I think continue to do so today. And those are resource-seeking activity, raw materials, the search for raw materials, especially agricultural commodities like soy, which are very important to China, and where Brazil in particular, Argentina, Uruguay to a degree, really produce a considerable amount of global soy. Oil has been in the past at least a very important sort of area of interest or sector of interest for China, and minerals too. Minerals that used to be related to infrastructure development, large-scale infrastructure development in China, but now gold and other minerals, lithium, that are largely related to high-tech production. That's been a real area of focus of late. In addition to that, market-seeking behavior, right? Looking for markets for Chinese exports, increasingly high value-added Chinese exports in most cases, right? Really, really high-tech things. And then internationalizing Chinese companies and Chinese brands, making sure that Chinese brands are competitive and that they are well-known in the Latin American and Caribbean region. This drives so much of the activity that we've seen. That said, a lot of what China does in terms of economic engagement frequently has political implications or implications on the style of governance that countries adopt and the ways in which they do business. Some of the things that Latin American companies are buying will also have certain effects on democratic principles and also on civil liberties and other things. So, it's very difficult sometimes to distinguish the sort of economic and political implications of Chinese engagement, and indeed the overall motivations, right, for Chinese engagement. Certainly, China is interested in ensuring, at the very least, that it has enough leverage in Latin America to be able to advance its own interests.
So, Margaret, what trends are evident in Chinese trade, finance, and FDI in the region?
We're seeing some actually very interesting trends, and I don't know to what extent these translate to other regions as well. Trade continues to grow, or at least remain at very high levels. Again, largely based on trade in commodities, right, or commodities exports from Latin America and imports of higher value-added goods, which has been a sort of characteristic of the trade dynamic from the very beginning of this enhanced relationship. And trade in particular has played a pretty prominent role in propping up certain countries, economically speaking, amid the COVID-19 economic crisis. In addition to that, you have some very targeted investment. Investment has slumped somewhat, right, during the pandemic, unsurprisingly, but we still see a lot of interest in acquisition of companies in the energy sector, in the mining sector, right, and some of these sort of traditional sectors, areas, industries of interest. But also, investment in a sort of wider range of tech-specific industries, and also trade, of course, in those areas as well. So I would say, across the board, regardless of the region's inclusion in the Belt and Road Initiative, regardless of wide-ranging other sort of policies issued toward Latin America, we've seen a real fluctuation in foreign direct investment over time. Some years it's very high, some years it's not so high. A lot depends on the projects that are negotiated and their overall value. But what I think we'll see in the coming years is more FDI, certainly, but much more focused on innovation, promoting sectors, very much in an effort for China to cultivate these industries and to ensure that it overcomes the middle income trap, which is really quite critical for China looking ahead. On the finance front, we're really seeing, finance has been a sort of prominent feature of the relationship for many, many years now. With about half of overall finance, China's given about $135 billion to the region since 2005, and about half of that has gone to Venezuela. We've seen a precipitous decline in Chinese finance, especially state-to-state finance, to the region since 2015. Nothing in 2020, nothing in 2021, and I don't expect more in the coming years. That said, there are some other financial actors, commercial banks, ICBC, for example, Bank of China, some private equity funds, and other sources of finance that are becoming increasingly active. I don't think we'll see the same billion-dollar numbers that we saw in the past, but we will see more activity from them in support mostly of Chinese companies.
So, in region, how else is China's engagement with the region changing?
That's such an interesting question. I would say there are a lot of ways I think that China's engagement with the region is changing, but I would point out, and this is something I think that's not well understood globally, is that the Belt and Road is about a whole lot more than just infrastructure. If we look at sort of, earlier definitions of the Belt and Road as articulated by Chinese scholars and Chinese ministries, it's a connectivity enhancing initiative, right? And involves, wide-ranging components. Infrastructure development is certainly one of those. So is financial connectivity, internationalizing the renminbi and achieving other sort of financial linkages, clearinghouses for the renminbi, for example, for China's currency, and currency swaps are something else that we see in Latin America. There's also policy coordination, and this is, I think, is an increasingly important area of focus for China in Latin America, not only as concerns Taiwan, and Taiwan has quite a few allies still in Latin America and the Caribbean. But on other matters of critical interest, for example, on internet governance policy or on other sort of high-tech policy, AI related or otherwise, on issues of human rights, right, and other issues that are of considerable concern to China and international organizations. And in addition to that, there is also sort of tech-related connectivity and people-to-people connectivity. And I would say one of the most important sort of shifts that we've seen of late, we've seen activity in all of these areas, really even predating the Belt and Road Initiative, certainly. But most recently, we've seen a real doubling down, an extensive effort in terms of public diplomacy, in terms of forging these people-to-people ties. Noting that by doing so, by creating these networks on the ground, not just at the bilateral government-to-government level, but in provinces, in states, in cities of different sizes, some capital cities, some fairly small cities, that by doing so, by having these networks, by cultivating a degree of trust at the local level, that a lot of these other objectives can be advanced more easily, political, commercial, or otherwise. And so I would say one really critical trend that we're seeing right now is a localization of activity to avoid potential conflicts at the national level, right? Or areas of I would say, just a general, disinterest in engaging perhaps among new administrations. But also to ensure, that the networks and the people-to-people connections are there when it is time to strike certain deals or to advance certain policy objectives or to advance certain objectives as concerns financial connectivity.
Margaret, I'm going to talk about a little bit. I would like to know about the COVID-19 process. How has the Chinese COVID-19 assistance affected the views of China in Latin America countries?
China. So that's a really important question, and I think there are a couple of components to this. If we look at what China did in terms of sort of COVID-19 related or medical outreach amid the COVID-19 crisis, it's easily divided into two phases. One was sort of shipment, some sales, some donations of equipment, of personal protective equipment and other equipment, medical equipment, intended to address, really the proliferation of this virus and its effect in various countries across the region. And China did indeed, again, through a very sort of decentralized approach, leveraging Chinese communities in certain cases, Chinese companies, government organizations, non-governmental organizations, NGO-type organizations, certainly the embassies themselves, to deliver, equipment to communities in need, to countries in need, but also to individuals that are, important partners to China in terms of advancing certain objectives. And so this was very welcome. At the onset of the pandemic, I think, there were many statements of gratitude issued by Latin American nations and Latin American leaders, and no doubt had some effect, right, on these countries' ability to address COVID-19 and especially specific medical challenges, equipment-related challenges. The second phase is related to vaccine dissemination. And here, I think, China has had a real advantage, in part because they were a first mover, right, in this respect. Chinese vaccines have been proven to not be as effective as other vaccines, for example, mRNA-type vaccines, in terms of preventing serious disease or serious effects of COVID-19, but they do provide some protection. And they were provided at very early on, at least comparatively speaking, right, in the pandemic, which was really quite critical. quite critical in terms of addressing the challenges associated with the pandemic, but also in terms of shaping views of China. And so the delays that we saw from the COVAX system, and certainly on the part of the US amid the political transition between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and certain legal challenges that had to be overcome to ensure, donations of vaccines, I think were a real sort of diplomatic failure. And there are efforts now to boost, deliveries of vaccines to the Latin American and Caribbean region and elsewhere. But China was a first mover in this respect, and that was really exceedingly important. And I think there is indeed a lot of gratitude among Latin American audiences for those efforts.
Margaret, when we come to the political leverage, does China have considerable political leverage in Latin America? If so, to what extent China has this leverage?
I would say, obviously, the Latin American region is very diverse, and Caribbean region, they are very, very diverse. There are, the countries have different sorts of relations with China. But in a lot of countries, especially those countries that depend heavily on China for commodities exports, right? There's an export market for things like soy or copper, for example. There is a degree of leverage, be it, I think in most cases, this leverage is indirect, right? This influence that China has is very indirect. There is an understanding among officials in these countries that they depend very heavily on the Chinese economy. And so I think there's a corresponding interest in not, upsetting China or in complying with certain, or adhering to certain interests, right, that China may articulate. But that leverage does exist. China is viewed. There are various ways in which China establishes leverage. One is through these trade ties, right, which in many cases are very balanced. Another is through investment in sectors that are deemed critical to a country's economic development. And another is, just through the promise of investment. It's remarkable to me that a lot of countries will do things and engage with China and think deeply about China's interests simply with the promise, the prospect, which may or may not materialize, right, of Chinese investment in mind. And certainly that's been the case as concerns Taiwan. For those countries that have cut ties with Taiwan, a lot of that was based on what they want to be the promise of enhanced trade or more extensive infrastructure or other investment in the country, or perhaps even of various forms. So, yes, there is leverage. How China and whether China will exert that leverage is another question. But it's there, right? And I think certainly there is a hope, right, or an expectation that eventually it will result in some support for Chinese interests, whether in terms of sort of policy making within these countries themselves, or in international organizations where China has advanced certain platforms and is looking for international support for those.
Margaret, when might we see some new opportunities for China in engagement given shifts in the Latin America political landscape? What will be your take on this area?
This is such a critical question. We see, extensive shifts across the entire region, right? Sort of swings back and forth in among the sort of leaderships or the presidents that are elected every few years. This is, evident now. It happened in Ecuador, right? It's happened in Peru. There are a number of upcoming elections where we may very well see a extensive shift in Brazil, for example, right? A major shift in ideology and in policy, and indeed in the quality of relations with China. That said, my sense is that, China is very pragmatic. It has interests in wide-ranging countries in the Latin American and Caribbean region, some of them related to, trade. Some of them related simply to establishing strong ties for eventual support, as I said, in international organizations, right? This is often the impetus for enhanced engagement in the Caribbean, for example, in addition to other reasons. So, my sense is that regardless of the outcome of upcoming elections or these sometimes dramatic shifts, political shifts in the region, we still see engagement. It's just that this engagement may wane somewhat over a period of years, right? Slow a little bit, but it's still there. Or it may be through different mechanisms. Instead of engaging with, the national government, as I mentioned, a lot of this activity may take place at a local level, where it's easier to strike deals, with mayors, and Chinese companies going directly to these mayors to explain the benefits, for example, of their safe cities or smart cities technologies and platforms. So it's not as though it would put a halt necessarily to Chinese engagement at all. It's just that there are different avenues that Chinese companies, government officials, and other organizations tasked with outreach will use, right, to make sure that things get done.
Margaret, I think today we are in a lucky day. There is a lot of questions. Now I would like to bring on screen. Maybe you can do the comment. Now there is a question. Could you read?
I can read it. Yeah. Shall I read it out loud, or just answer it?
Yeah, you can answer or comment on. You can pass also.
So regarding the final stage of the Panama Canal. So I don't know. There's the Nicaragua Canal project, right, which was something that China pursued, or one billionaire in China, Wang Jing, pursued for a number of years. And he actually very recently congratulated President Ortega on his victory in what many in the U.S. have described as a sham election there. But so it's still involved to some degree, at least in terms of personal ties to that particular administration. In Panama, I mean, there was the Panama Canal expansion, and when Panama cut ties with, and that wasn't explicitly China related, but when Panama cut ties with Taiwan in 2017, it joined the Belt and Road Initiative. It was the first country to sign on and demonstrate support for the Belt and Road Initiative in Latin America. And at that time also, it struck approximately 16 deals with China, some canal related, some other infrastructure, some ports were mentioned among those, and then a number of other sort of buildings and construction projects that were of interest to Panama at the time. A lot of those are advancing. Some of the more critical ones, for example, a bridge over the Panama Canal that will address some sort of some of the infrastructure challenges that are in place. Some of those aging infrastructure issues have been halted or postponed at the very least. I don't see any outright cancellations, but they're in this current government in Panama. There has been, I think, some effort to stall these, to review them, perhaps to derive additional benefit from Chinese investment on Chinese companies as they look to indeed expand their operations in Panama. There is still a lot of interest in Panama among Chinese companies. The extent to which some of these projects will move ahead is questionable, but a lot of them are already underway. The free trade agreement that was supposed to be negotiated between Panama and China appears to be sort of, in a period of protracted stasis at the moment, but may very well advance at some future phase.
There is I bring next question. How will China?
This is a great question. How does China differ from Russia in its relations with Latin America? Will we see examples of the Cuban Missile Crisis in the coming years? I think, there are very big differences, right, in terms of the way that Russia and China engage. There are concerns across the board, I think, about, at least here in the U.S. where I'm sitting, right? And I don't know, I think they may be shared in certain countries in Latin America and maybe not in others, about misinformation. about or disinformation campaigns, efforts to, especially on the part of Russia, right, to influence elections and electoral outcomes through, very extensive and coordinated disinformation campaigns. I don't think we see the same extent of sort of campaign-related interference on the part of China, but we do see a lot of efforts to engage with local media, content sharing arrangements that ensure that in some cases an entire speech by Xi Jinping is aired, for example, in Brazil. And so there are a lot of efforts to ensure that messaging, right, from both is indeed, Eva has a place in certain Latin American countries and addresses Latin American audiences. So that's a similarity and something of a difference. But in general, the economic differences are huge, right? China engages extensively in trade, investment, all over the region. Russia's investment and trade are far more limited. They're there, but they're far more limited. And of course, a big focus for Russia in the region is arms sales. By a question from Eliza Murray, what does China mean for Latin American countries? Is the rise of a communist country seen as a camaraderie achievement in countries in the region? I think it probably depends largely, right, on the country that we're talking about. A lot of countries have looked at China as an alternative partner to the United States. A lot of countries have also looked to China out of necessity, right? Venezuela, a number of years ago in the 1990s, and 2000s under Chavez, saw China as a critical partner in terms of, given its close relationship with the U.S. and its limited access to international capital markets. And so China indeed became that for Venezuela. And China didn't talk a whole lot about, I think, their common ideological pursuits, but Venezuela certainly did, and that was a big part of Venezuela's description of China-Venezuela relationship. The same has been, there have been similar efforts by other administrations in the past to sort of highlight, socialist ties at the very least, and there are a lot of efforts on the part of the International Liaison Department, which is sort of the foreign affairs arm of the Chinese Communist Party, to engage extensively with parties across the region, right? But not just socialist or communist parties, parties across the entire political spectrum, in an effort to cultivate ties that indeed may be of value looking ahead in whatever form.
Now, the U.S. had a strong lesson of sorts.
The U.S. had a strong understanding of Soviet intentions back during the Cold War in Latin America, right? Is it possible to say that the U.S. understands China's intentions and capabilities in Latin America? There's certainly a lot of effort dedicated to understanding this. I know I do this I don't think I represent, obviously, the U.S. as a whole. I'm one person here, but I'm across the board within the government, right? And within academia. In the U.S., there are a lot of efforts to understand China's global efforts and intentions, China's foreign policy and how it's evolving. What is the Belt and Road, and what are its effects and implications, broadly speaking? A real concerted effort to study these things and to engage indeed with Latin American countries to understand how they view all of this. What I think, we are still trying to do in the U.S. is to understand what an appropriate response would be, and an effective response would be given the concerns that have been articulated by both the Trump and Biden administrations. Is it possible to see Brazil as a major barrier to Chinese expansion in Latin America, or is Brazil a country that can approach China when it comes to trade? So, Brazil is a really fascinating case, Jessica. This is certainly the Bolsonaro government, right, has not publicly been supportive of stronger Brazil-China ties and has in many cases sought to impede further progress in Brazil-China bilateral cooperation in various areas. That said, the Brazil-China relationship is so strong and the ties are so well established, especially in terms of trade, but also Brazil continues to be viewed as as an attractive investment destination for many countries, in part because they are well established there, in part because it is a very large market, so market seeking investments to make sense, if we're a Chinese company to the region. And so a lot of activity continues despite what is sort of a challenging state-to-state relationship, and indeed a contentious one at times. Pretty heated exchanges with Chinese and Brazilian officials on Twitter. So, and as I mentioned before, frequently when there are these problems at the national level, these sort of challenging relations at the national level, you see things happening at the local level, especially in countries with very decentralized systems of governance, like Brazil. Sao Paulo state has a lot of its own agreements with China, as do others, and even municipalities. And so things are happening. Things are happening because there is considerable commercial rationale for them, right? And a lot of interest on the part of certain specific interest groups, right, in making things happen and continuing certain elements of this relationship.
Now, Margaret, I have one last question. I'm going to bring on screen.
Are Sino-Latin American relations only economic and commercial relations, or these relations gain military dimensions in the future? This is a really important question, one I think that there is some debate about in the Latin American and Caribbean region. Certainly there is a military dimension already to China's engagement with Latin America. There are plenty of sort of military exchanges. There are sales of military equipment. There was the establishment a number of years ago of a deep space research facility in Neuquén, Argentina, which is run almost exclusively by the People's Liberation Army. And so there is military activity. There are military exchanges. There are military, there are missions, right? Aid related often by hospital ships and other sort of, military, various military branches, right, to conduct sort of development or aid-related activities across the region, trainings and things of that nature. So this is happening. The extent to which it will continue to happen is unclear. The extent to which China's motivations, I think, in Latin America are military related is also unclear. What I will say is that among the defense community in Latin America, there are a number of concerns that they've articulated, in particular as concerns investment in ports that have very little commercial rationale. And so they view those ports as potentially being used in a future, possible contingency, whether with the U.S. or otherwise, as for military purposes, in addition to possibly commercial ones. So that's one area of focus that that we see among the defense community in the U.S. In other cases, there are simply concerns about the nature of Chinese investment, the nature of Chinese economic engagement overall, and whether that is indeed furthering of democratic erosion. It's a process already underway in Latin America and many parts of the world, but furthering of democratic erosion in the region would obviously have implications for stability in a number of countries, and would be something that would be a tremendous concern to the U.S., given that this is indeed instability ends up being a hemispheric issue.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Given the question, I think the importance of China and Latin America relations are growing. There is a lot of interest from my audiences because the question, I think, really is the qualitative questions.
Terrific questions. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much, Margaret, for joining me today for this great information and provide a great picture about Latin America-China relations.
Certainly, my pleasure.
And also thank you for my audiences for questions. Please don't forget to subscribe to channel. Thank you very much. See you in next shows.